Oh, I'm about to start, Ida.
Okay.
And so if you could,
I'll lower that light.
yeah, and also you probably want to mute yourself. Let me just see what this is doing. I hate it when they're circling at me.
This thing here is bothering you, this light?
No, I said I hate it when the computer is just showing me a screen with something that's going round and round and round, like this one was. Okay, very good. All right, so we finished pretty much finished chapter 1. There were maybe a couple comments left from chapter 1. The Ramat Valley points out why in the very beginning, in the first chapter, does it end with saying Vayihi Daniel ad shnat achat lechoresh hamelech? Like, okay, you've told us how he got there and about his schooling, and he got to the point of the fact that he's standing before the king. The Ramat Valley gave us that beautiful piece about standing before the king means that the siman of what's going on down here below is a sign of what's going on in the upper worlds as well, standing before Hamelach, Kodesh Baruch Hu. And we were told that he was found to be, 10 measures greater than the Chartumim and the Ashafim that were in the kingdom. Here it just mentions 2 different kinds of advisors. We didn't talk about what they are. We're going to hear about that again at the beginning of chapter 2, so we'll wait for that. But the Ramat Valley, others also, but the Ramat Valley in particular question, what is this business about saying that Daniel served until the first year of Koresh HaMelech? So in the time of Koresh, that's when the Beit HaMikdash was rebuilt. Or he gave again, our timeline about everything that's going on there is a little complicated. It's not clear. It got started, it got stopped, it got started again. But Koresh had some kind of nevuah, evidently, that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he was to allow the Jews to go back and to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and he not only gives them permission to, he also sends money. He sets the ones who go back, they are free from giving any taxes to him, and he sends money for the Beit HaMikdash to be rebuilt, etc. And other things happen, and the permission gets rescinded, and then comes the Esther story, and then there's another Koresh later on who actually follows through.
That one we have streets that are called Koresh?
Yes, that's why the streets are called Koresh, because thanks to him, Yerushalayim was rebuilt and became a major city again. And so that's... But why did Daniel serve up until that point? So the Ramat Valley, who sometimes gives us sort of pshat and sometimes gives us sod, mamash, sod. So he says that Daniel, Vayihi Daniel ad shnat achat v'koresh hamelech, that he continued in his importance by the various kings. He continued to be a royal advisor until Koresh, who was the first king of Paras, as opposed to the Medes, as opposed to the Bavli, etc. And Koresh was a Baal Gaiva himself. And he thought that he was bigger, better, more important than anybody else. Because Baruch Hu revealed himself to him, and so he decides he doesn't need Daniel. Everybody else sort of depended on Daniel to be an explainer, if not full out a navi, but to help them to interpret what it is that God was asking of them to do in the world. And so he, according to Ramad Valley, what does Koresh say to himself? He says in his pride that all of the nations of the world God gave me. And he put me in charge, and he gave me the task of building him a house in Yerushalayim, which is in Yehuda, as though I'm, he's the overlord and I'm second to God. Okay. And so he figures that, that therefore he didn't want to have Daniel near him. This is the Ramad Valley's suggestion. Not that Daniel's been doing this job for 70 years and he's an old man, okay, and not anything else, but that he didn't want to share the limelight with Daniel by God. So he sent Daniel away. Okay. Anyway, so when he, because of this sense of arrogance and this sense of pride, it's like, okay, now I'm the main man on stage. So you who have been the main man on stage, there can't be two leading men in this film, right? So Daniel, you're off stage as of right now, and as though that's what it were. So the Ramad Valley points this out to us. And then he makes some other comparisons. He says it's similar to the issue with David and Shlomo, that David natal et malchut bisman hadin. He while it was a time of din and gvura, that was David HaMelech's time. V'lechein nitfal nitapel b'milchamot kol yimei chayav, and so he ended up being involved with all sorts of wars all the days of his life. Shlomo beno natal et malchut bizman hachesed, and Shlomo took the rule in the time of chesed, and therefore he was an ish shalom kol yimei chayav. And the suggestion is that Koresh wanted to be known as this, he basically inherited a kingdom that was the superpower. He didn't actually inherit it, but he got appointed to be in charge of this kingdom that was basically a superpower. And Nebuchadnezzar had fought, and the Dariush had fought, and Achashverosh, Bahuli, and all of these wars had all taken place. And Daniel had been the advisor through this entire period, which was the time of din. And now comes the time of chesed, the time of building the bayit. And so it's like David was king up to this line, and then Shlomo is king, right? And we had the medrash that says, David wanted to know when he was going to die. When he was told he was going to die on Shabbat, he asked to die on Erev Shabbat or on Motzei Shabbat. He didn't want to die on Shabbat. And God says to him, I'm not willing to give up a day of your prayers and of your tehillim and of your being king. I'm not willing to give up a day of it. So I'm not willing to make it a day earlier. And so he says, well, then give me till Motzei Shabbat. He didn't want to die on Shabbos, right? And he says, so give me until then. And he says, no, I'm not willing to give up. God says, no, I'm not willing to, to give up one moment of Shlomo's rule either. It's from here to, it's there's this fine line, and it's the one to the other. And so it's interesting anyway, that, and the Ramat Valley had pointed out in this same little essay here on this last verse from chapter 1, he points out that notice that this tzaddik, this righteous person, is called Daniel because his shorish is from the din of Kedusha and not from the chesed. And so he's right, he's Zera Melucha of David, who is also this man of Gvura and of Din, even though he's also, the sweet singer of Israel. But Bechozot, he has this aspect of Din and Damim that goes with David and that also goes with just even that name, Daniel. And so the Ramat Valley is saying you can hear it in the words, and we have this pattern before, and he's just pointing that out, that he sort of went off on this tangent to let us know this is why it was at that point that Daniel got pushed off the stage, as it were. All right. And so now we're going to start with chapter 2. Here we are. Now we're going to start with chapter 2. I'm going to read, I got some pushback after the first session when I read through the whole chapter and then went back to teach the pieces of it. And I was asked to please do it unit by unit, but not starting off and just doing question didn't work for some of the people in the class. And so I'm doing it a little differently for this chapter. The first several verses, if you're following along in a Tanakh, the first several verses are still Hebrew. Okay, that would be verses 1 through the middle part of verse 4, at which point we're told that they spoke Aramaic, and from then till the end of chapter 7, it's all going to be in Aramaic. But we'll go through these first verses, which are kind of an introduction. Like many of the chapters and units in Sefer Daniel, it starts with a timeline, or at least, like from your correspondent in Bavel, B'shnat Shtayim L'malchut Nebuchadnezzar. Right? And so we hear that frequently. And the problem that we run into is we heard at the beginning of the previous chapter, that was the only time when there's reference outside of Bavel. It was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, and then we discover it's not really the 3rd year of his rule. Maybe it was the 3rd year of his rebellion. And then Nebuchadnezzar came and he besieged the city and this, that, and the other. And it's not clear if Daniel comes then, or if Daniel comes, there's a second taking hostages and etc. that we're told about in Sefer Divrei Yamim. And then Daniel gets there. And so it's clearly way more than the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar, because the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar was not after Jehoiakim had paid taxes to him for 3 years and had rebelled for 3 years, right? The 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar was at the beginning of that time. So before Daniel ever shows up, it's at least 6 or 7 years of Malchut Nebuchadnezzar. So the most common response that Chazal have to the problem of saying the 2nd year of Malchut Nebuchadnezzar is to say that his rule started to be counted from the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. I mean, because even if you say, oh, his rule starts to be counted from when he had besieged Jerusalem and exerted control over Jerusalem, you still have the problem that Daniel and his friends were in school for 3 years. We were just told that in the previous chapter. And so if this is in the second year of their time there, they're still students. Now, in the beginning, we're not going to hear about Daniel, but at the end of this first section, the first section actually lasts for 13 verses. At the end of this first section, we hear that Daniel and his chevra are getting swept up in the king's anger at his advisors, and he's getting ready to put all of his advisors to death, make a clean sweep and start over again, and that Daniel and his chevra are counted amongst them. So it can't, how can it be the second year if Daniel and his friends don't even show up as advisors until 3 years after they arrive, which presumably is more than the third year. So again, the response that many of our Mefarshim give to that question is that the Shnat 2 L'Malchut Nebuchadnezzar is the second year since the Churban of Yerushalayim. And that's about as much of a hint as we have in Sefer Daniel to things that are going on in Eretz Yisrael. It's a book that's focused on the things that are happening in Daniel's own life, vis-a-vis his friends, vis-a-vis his relationship to God, vis-a-vis his position in the court. Very little about what's going on with the Jews in Bavel, and much less about what's going on with the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Like that we're not hearing about at all. All right. And so the verse goes on, and it says, Chalam Nebuchadnezzar chalomot, v'titpa'em rucho ushnato nihyata alav. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, and the Malbim says, why dreams and not he dreamt a dream. One dream. Why is it plural? What's the plural thing that's going on here? And titpa'em, you may recognize the shorish as the same shorish for the word pa'amon, a bell, right? His ruach, his spirit, his sense of emotional equilibrium was ringing like a bell. It was ringing itself. Okay, he had this dream, and it was causing he was very disturbed. And then it says, Ushnato nihyata alav. The simple understanding of that is that his sleep was disturbed, right? With echoes, by the way, of Yosef. There was Paro and also echoes of Achashverosh, right? The time when the king's sleep is disturbed. So Paro, who wakes up suddenly from a dream and then falls back asleep and has another dream and wakes up suddenly from that dream. And it disturbs his sleep. Or Achashverosh, where his sleep was disturbed in Nada Shnat Melech. But here the word is nihyata. Malbim says that seems very weird because nihyata is passive of the word to be. It sort of means like became. And in fact, that's what Malbim specifically says. He says nihyata sounds like nitava. It became. The sleep became. And that's sort of weird because, in fact, what we know is that he didn't actually ever succeed in getting himself back to sleep. That's our understanding of it, is he kept trying to sleep, but it sounds like his sleep became asleep on him. The language is very strange. So the Malbim has a little bit of an answer for that. The Ramat Valley also has an answer for that. But I want to get through a few verses and we'll see if we can pull some ideas together. So the next verse is the king Vayomer Hamelech ligro lechartumim laashafim lamchashvim v'lakasdim lahagid lemelech chalamotav v'yavo v'yamdu lifnei Hamelech. Okay, he says that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
It reminds me like when we hear the Megillat Esther, like V'yomer HaMelech, and then and then it comes Lifnei HaMelech. Was this sung to communities? Was there someone who sang this?
What, who sang Sefer Daniel? I mean,
it's a rhyming pattern, because when you see Im L'Chatmim L'Hashpaim U'Lamachshafim U'Lakashadim, I can imagine like kids going L'Machshadim L'Chashadim. Maybe this was melodic in a way.
Well, okay. I mean, there are tamim. I do not know the tamim for the ketuvim, and I don't know whether Daniel is read with the same like
Tehillim. Tehillim has a pattern.
Tehillim may have a pattern, but we do not know the nigun for Tehillim. We do not know how to sing the Tamei HaMikra for Tehillim. They use the same symbols on Tehillim as they use for Chumash and as they use for Navi, but there's one way to sing those symbols when it's on Chumash. There's a different way to sing those symbols when it's on the Navi. That's the way the Haftorah gets sung. And Tehillim had its own way to sing it that was, and there's a different way to read the Megillot, right? And Megillat Eicha is different from Megillat Esther, is different from Megillat Ruth. The Ruth and Kohelet and okay, I'm blanking. Esther has its own nigun, which is parts of it are different. Kohelet, Ruth, Esther, Eicha, and Shir. Okay, and so there are ways of singing those, the Megillot, that are not the same as the way of singing either the Torah or the Haftorah. Tehillim, we've lost it. Mishlei, we've lost it. And I don't know. I mean, when I look in a Mikro Gedolot, I see that there are the Tamim, but I don't know how to sing it. I mean, partly just that I don't know. And I also don't know that we know in general that we have a tradition that it gets sung exactly the same way. It's possible, it certainly is possible that people used to sing all of these, because to have, what we have today with the internet, or what we have today just because of the printing press in the last several hundred years, where every Jewish home can have a Jewish library, is an amazing gift. And, certainly 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, well, no, Daniel's less than 3,000 years ago, but 2,500 years ago to 500 years ago. So for a period of 2,000 years, only rich people could have a copy of this. Right. And so I'm sure that it was sung because the singing of it would make it come alive to some extent, and it would also make it it would make it easier for people to remember it, because even though Torah Shebichtav is supposed to be read out of a scroll or out of a book, it's not necessarily supposed to be quoted Baal Peh. But, I know that my kids would go see Shakespeare in the park and come home quoting Shakespeare from just having heard it. they had a good ear for it, better than I do for memorizing things. They had a good ear for it, and they would be quoting lines. They go to see a movie, they come home, they quote lines from the movies. And so I think that's part of what's going on, certainly, with these kinds of things. And it's quite possible that the way that something gets written in a time when even though people could read, but where most people couldn't afford a book, couldn't afford the scroll. So I'm sure that there's that the tune that you sing it to helps you to remember it and helps you to learn it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out. There we go. That works. All right. So yes, and so now what's happening? But now we hear, and you're absolutely right. Right? It's chartumim, ashafim, mechashvim, l'chasdim. There are four. Are there four different groups? Are there whatever? So different people have different ways of explaining what these four groups are. And I pointed out that near the end of chapter 1, we only heard about two of the groups, the Chartumim and the Ashafim. We didn't hear about the Mechashvim and the Kasdim. Not everybody agrees on how to define who these four groups are and what they are exactly. Some of the words, particularly Chartumim, is a word that you should recognize from Sefer Bereshit. Maybe not. Is it in Sefer Bereshit? I think it is by Paro when they can't answer what his dreams are, and then Yosef comes on stage. But the Chartumim, I believe, also show up again when Moshe is doing the signs and bringing the first of the plagues, and they try to duplicate the plagues. And at some point, when it gets to the Kinim, they're no longer able to duplicate the plagues. And then they say, oh, this is Etzba Elokim. Up until here, we knew how to do the same thing. Maybe he's just, a better magician than we are, or a better astrologer, or whatever the word is. We're going to talk about it in just a second. But from then on, they said, no, that's Etzba Elokim. Okay, so the word Chartumim we've heard in Tanakh. The word Ashafim we have not heard. The word Mechashvim we've heard in the sense that that's one of the types of...
That's like you're calling some that, you're calling them like a witch.
Yes, Mechashef, you're not allowed to allow them to stay alive. That's one of the types of like the Yidoni and the Ba'on. You're not allowed to, right? Don't suffer a witch to live. And that's the Mechashef, or Mechashefa, actually, because in the Torah, it's actually in the feminine. Okay, so of these four words, the first one we heard in Mitzrayim, the third one we heard in Vayikra, and the other two we have not heard. Kasdim just sounds like people from Ur Kasdim. Like, why is that a separate category? Okay, the Bavlim called themselves Kasdim. Bavel was one city, and Ur Kasdim was another city, and there was somebody named Kesed, who was actually the son of Nahor, grandson of Terach. He's a first cousin to Yitzchak Avinu. The son of Nahor that we're most familiar with is Betuel, who is Rivka's father, right? Rivka's father and Lavan's father, and therefore he's Rachel and Leah's grandfather. But this is their uncle, okay, was somebody named Kesed. Now, I'm assuming actually that the Kasdim are not directly descended from Kesed because there was already the city of Ur-Kasdim. So I'm assuming he was given the name Kesed. Maybe he was born in Ur-Kasdim, whatever. But that's where the name as a name shows up in the Torah in Parshat Noach. In Parshat Noach, right before Lech Lecha. Okay. So first of all, the Malbim. So the Malbim says the Chartumim are people who work with the secrets of nature. They do things by sleight of hand. They do things by, they do all kinds of whisperings and as though it's magical incantations, but it's really that they know more science than anybody else does. And so they do things that appear magical to others, but they're really working with nature. I'm first giving you the Malbim's definition. We're going to see that basically the definition of the types of advisors that the king had, everybody pretty much agrees on what the levels are. They just don't necessarily agree on which word means which. The Ashafim, Malbim says, those are the astrologers. The Atztanignim, also from Shemot, and from the Rishonim, the Meforshim on that. The Mechashfim, which are the witches, so he says they work with shading. They know how to access the underworld, as it were. They don't know how to access angels. They know how to access the powers of the Sitra Achra, and they work with that. And then the Kasdim, according to the Malbim, they use Gorolot, like Lahapil Pur. That's basically what Haman did. Was the type of thing that they used, and then they interpreted, throwing dice, tarot cards, that sort of thing, and then how do you interpret it to understand what it means or what you want it to mean, or etc. That was what the costume did. That was the Malbim's definition of them. Steinsaltz simply said these are different levels of people who work with Gilui Atidot Upotrei Chalamot. So Gilui Atidot means they reveal the future. They're soothsayers. They're financial advisors that make that make a prediction as to what the market's going to do. There are information agencies who try to predict what's going to happen next year. To the degree that they can, they work off of real data, and they work off of, and they work off of signs that they can read in the universe. And beyond that, they try to develop a chush for it. They try to develop some, sort of some skill at reading, whether it's reading tea leaves or whether it's paying attention to hemlines to make there are all sorts of things that people notice correlations between this thing, and then they use that to try to make predictions. Correlation is not causation, but that would be Gilui Atidot. They're trying to figure out what's going to happen, and whether the weather forecasters, right? So to some extent, it's people who are trying to take data and work with the data. And, they, particularly back in the day, if they hid the source of the data and the source of their predictions, they could make themselves appear to be mysteriously powerful. even though perhaps what they were predicting didn't require nevuah or even ruach hakodesh, it just required good paying attention to what's going on in the world. And potrei cholomot, on the other hand, are like psychologists to some extent. Now, it depends on what kind of a cholom it is. There are cholomot, there's that whole long section of Agadata in Gemara Brachot that talks about dreams. And there are some dreams that are simply your brain reworking the things that you saw during the day and putting them together in sort of phantasmagorical associations. But a dream is also a place for your spirit to be in touch with godliness. And so a dream has, Chazal tell us that there's no dream that doesn't have an element of shtut in it, an element of foolishness, something that can't be real. And there's no dream that doesn't, actually, that's not true. Not that there's no dream. There are dreams that are really and purely just based on the stuff that you were thinking about when you went to sleep. But there are very few dreams, according to Chazal, especially the ones that are vivid, lucid dreams that don't have an element of Ruach HaKodesh, which is on the way to Nevuah. And so potrei cholomot are people not who solve dreams, but who decode the meaning of the dream, either the meaning of the dream for you as an individual or the meaning of the dream for how you should behave in the world, or the meaning. And if you're a king, okay, and you're visited with a very vivid dream, it could be that you ate too much, right? And you're having indigestion, but it could very well be that it's God letting you know something. And so you need somebody who can reveal and interpret your dream. Okay. The Ramat Vali suggests, so he gives a similar set of definitions as the Malbim did, but not the same words. Okay. He says that the Chartumim are the ones who deal with the, so he's pretty much goes according to, there's a medrash. I'm going to open up for myself. If you want me to, I can share my screen. But if nobody asks to share the screen, I'm just going to read it to you. So in the Medrash Tanchuma, it says, Chartumim, Rabbi Sivan says the Chartumim, it doesn't say Chartumim, it says Chartumim, okay? In other words, the vav, the u sound is not, there's no vav to hold it. It's written what we call chaser. And he says those are the ones who ask betime metim. So that's like the bal'on, which is forbidden. And it's also, in other words, they take like a finger bone, or they take objects of a dead person, and they try to raise the spirits of the dead in order to speak with them, in order to find out things that are accessible to somebody who's only a spirit and not tied to this material world. And that would be more like what Malbim called the mechashvim, the what we call witches. The ashafim, that's basically what the Ramat Vali, I think the Ramat Vali must have been going off of this Medrash Tanchuma. And then the ashafim, he says, these are the ones who play with luck. Okay, so that would be more like the business of using gorolot, which is what Malbim called the casting. Okay, so like I said, it's not that they disagree about the types of magic or the types of ways in which humanity attempts to know the unknown and the unknowable. All right. there are these different branches of it, and we have our own branches of it today. But there's some disagreement as to which word means which. That's really basically what I was trying to tell you. And they say it's like lashon dochek. It's like trying to push the language. Shneimar shamu zot hashafim evyon. They try to so he's saying the ashafim are people who use the goral, who use various kinds of fortune tellers. Okay, and mechashvim, according to Medrash Tanchuma, they're really witches. He doesn't go into any details on it. The Ramat Valley. Okay, I already did that piece. And then he has a really neat piece, but I'm going to save that for later. The Chartumim are those who work with magic by means of bones of dead people. The Ashafim are, so he says, those are the Chachmei Teva. That's what Malbim called the Chartumim. Okay, like I said, the names switched around. The Mechashvim are those that work magic by means of all sorts of other objects in the world, not including the bones of the dead. And Kastim, he says, those are Hovrei Shemaim Holchim Tamid Acharitz Tagnut of theirs. In other words, they're the astrologers. So everybody agrees that we have astrologers and real witches that can actually work magic, and people who deal with the spirits of the dead or with shadim, and people who just simply know how to use the natural world, but in ways that other people don't know. And so they appear to be magical to the people of their time. That may be more than anybody actually really wanted to know, but that's what those 4 words mean. And so he calls to all these different kinds of people. And so the question is that if you're Malbim, you think that the Kastim are the ones who are using the Gorolot. And if you're Ramat Valley, you think that the Kastim are the astrologers. And that's going to be important because in verse 4, we're going to see that the Kastim speak up. The Kastim are also, as I said, they're the Bavlim. They're the ones who are from Nebuchadnezzar's own people, as opposed to these other kinds of advisors or soothsayers or, future tellers or prophets, whatever it is, maybe from all over the world. So he calls them lahagid l'melech chalamotav, to tell the king his dreams. The Chidah says that they understood that to mean that he was calling them to tell him what his dreams meant, not to literally tell him what was it that he dreamt. Little did they know. All right. And so they came and they stood before the king. And the reason the Chidah tells us how it was that they understood this word lahagid is evidently because he had the feeling that had they really understood it to mean, I want you to come and tell me what it was that I dreamt. Come tell me what I'm thinking about. Right? You're going to say, I can't do that. Nobody can do that. And you would run away and hide because you would be concerned that you were going to be on the hook for doing it if you actually showed up. So the fact that they showed up was because they didn't understand when he said lahagid l'melech chalamotav. They didn't understand it to mean literally that he was going to ask them to tell him what it was that he dreamt, as well as to interpret what it was that he dreamt. And so that was how the Chidah talks to us about it. And they come and they stand, and it's interesting to me because there it says, it's that same phrase again, v'amdu lifnei hamelach. Now, back in verse 19 of chapter 1, Ramad Valley tells us that when Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah amdu lifnei hamelach, that was a siman by standing before the Melech Tachto, and that was the siman of their position vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu also, and that it was, that what goes on down below is a siman for what's going on b'makbil in the heavens, and that these various, between science and outright dealing with the Sitra Achra kind of people are standing before the king. I would have been interested. Ramad Valley does not go back and revisit the phrase. I really wanted him to. I was so hoping he was going to come back to that phrase and say, just as it meant this by Daniel and his friends, right? Again, it was a group of 4 at, in the end of chapter 1. So it means, and then that he would actually explain to me what it means. And I'm left with only the echo of what he said before, because he didn't even address it in this verse. But I noticed it, so I asked my own question on that. And now the verse says, Vayomer lahem hamelech chalom chalamti, and the king says to them, I dreamt a dream. Okay, right? Shades of Paro and Yosef, etc. Actually, Paro first told it over to his Chartumim, etc., and then Yosef shows up on the scene. So that's very similar to our story here. V'tipaim ruchi l'da'at et hachalom. And now, in verse 1, it says v'titpaim. And in verse 3, when he's describing it, it says v'tipaim. And there's a question about what is the difference between those two. And let's see, is it? Oh, I can't do it off of that one. So there are people who discuss it. It's not. It may have been in a longer piece by the Alshich that I read, but I can't I can't highlight on Svaria is the problem. And so I didn't save out just that little bit. But the difference between Titpa'im and Tipa'im is that Titpa'im, he knew what the dream was, and the dream itself, from inside of himself, his ruach was like, he was shaking like a bell, ringing with this dream, but it's reflexive, right? It's sort of a feedback loop on himself. In verse 3, when he says v'tipa'em ruchi l'da'at et hachalom, he's saying my spirit rang, right? In order to know what is the dream. When his sleep was disrupted and he was not able to sleep, to the point that he called them to come to him immediately in the middle of the night, evidently, according to some of our Mefarshim, he still remembered what the dream was. He forgot it. He doesn't know what the dream itself was. All he has is the leftover impression that, he's left with the echo, as it were. He doesn't have the dream itself. He just has this echo of this bong of the bell. Okay. And so, I need to know even what the dream itself is. Okay. and what it's foretelling me about the future. And so now comes the response, and we're about to switch from Hebrew into Aramaic. Vaidabru hakastim. Okay, and I have about 10 minutes left, so I'll get maybe 1 or 2 verses into the Aramaic itself. Vaidabru hakastim l'melech. The kastim, like we said, either these are the ones who use the goral, or they're the astrologers. More to the point, they're the Bavlim themselves. Okay, they're from the same nation, etc., as the king is, and they speak to him Aramite, which is interesting. In the previous chapter, we heard that Daniel and his Chava are supposed to be taught the language and the book, right? Both the Lashon and the Sefer of the Kastim. And now the Kastim are speaking Aramite. So we get this identification that the language of the Kastim is Aramaic. And it's an Aramaic. If you are familiar with Onkelos, if you're familiar with the language, the language of the Targum or the language of the Medrash, etc., this is not that same Aramaic, because the Targum and the Medrash are from the end of Beit Sheni, and maybe even a few hundred years after that. And the Aramaic of Sefer Daniel is from before Beit Sheni. It's from the time of the end of Beit Rishon. And so that's a good 500 years. And if you think that you could go out on the street of England in the year, 1500 and understand fully what's being said just because you speak English today, that you fully understand the English of Shakespeare and right before Shakespeare, it would be difficult. Okay. And the language changed over time. But even if you're familiar with the Aramaic, after you hear it for a while, you start to hear it. And there are still many of the same sorts of linguistic shifts that we know about from Aramaic into Hebrew. It's still a Semitic language. Okay. So the Kasdim spoke to the king, and they spoke this language called Aramite. And they said, Malka la'almin chaye, okay? Yechi melech la'olam, right? Sounds pretty much the same. Malka is ha-melech, the aleph at the end is the hey at the beginning. La'alamin, forever. Chaye, you should live. Okay? Amar chelma la'avdach, uvishra nechave. Amar, say, chelma ha-chalom, the dream, la'avdach, and you see, right, to your servant. Ufishra pesher hadvarim. So that's a phrase. That's a word in Hebrew. Pesher hadvarim is the explanation of the matter, right? And nechaveh is the language of lahagid. We speak about something being a chavaya, right? Is a chavaya. It was, wow, what an experience that was. What's an experience? Something that I want to be able to tell over to somebody else, right? It's something that made such an impression on me that I want to tell it over. It becomes part of the narrative that I tell myself about my life, is a chavaya. And so that, in Aramaic, that's the shorsh that gets used for lahagid. So this, just to translate this verse, because we've now switched from Hebrew into Aramaic, just to translate it. So if I translate it first into Hebrew, then into English, right? It's Melech la'olam tichya, or yechi, you should live. Amor et hachalom la'avdecha, v'nisaper We'll explain. It's so the language you hear, it's really not that far off if you relax and don't say, it's Aramaic and I can't deal with it. It turns out it's not so far away. All right. And then the next pasuk, I have time for one more. The next pasuk, I think, right? I have different times on different clocks. Okay. So I'll give you one more verse. Ane Malka va'amar. So that's like, we see this in Tanakh all the time. V'ya'an hamelech va'amar. And he responded and he said, okay, lakasta'e, which is lakasdim. Okay, that's just the Aramaic plural ending, lakasdai or lakasta'e. That's like saying el hakasdim. Milta mini azda. Hadavar halach mimeni. Mini is mimeni. Azda is like azla, which is the later Aramaic would have a lamed where that dalet is. Although the Yerushalmi still used the dalet, the bav, whatever. There are different dialects of Aramaic. So that, and the dalet lamed, if you feel, say a d, and now say a l, and you'll notice your tongue is in the same place. Azda, azla, your tongue didn't really move. It's just a question of how much air you're letting go around it. And so that's where a lot of the linguistic shifts take place. Over time, people shifted exactly how they said it. And because, as we pointed out, language at that point, although things were written, we learned that the reason that they had to learn the Sefer of the costume, in other words, the written language of the costume, is because Aramaic in those days was not written with our aleph bet. Aramaic in those days was written in a syllabary, which is a much more difficult kind of language to learn. It's more like Chinese is. It's a much more difficult language to learn how to read rather than an alphabet-based system. And so when we went to write it down, when Daniel went to write it down, he was transliterating it. And so to transliterate it at that time, it sounded like azda. To his ear, it heard like a dalet. He put in a dalet. Later on, they were transliterating it into Hebrew letters, and it sounded like azla. It's the same word. It's the same meaning. And like I said, it's made in the same part of the mouth. But now it sounds like azla, and so it gets transliterated into a lamed. So he tells them milta is like milah. The word milah, right? The word milah means davar, means the thing, word. Milta mini as the matter has escaped me. The matter went away from me. Hen la tahoda anuni chalma ufishre hadamin tit avdun uvatechon nevale yit samon. Okay, so this is, depending on which Sefer you have, some of them actually have translations into approximate translations or actual translations into Hebrew. And this one says, right, hen la, if not, tahodanuni, if you don't, now that you should be able to see, lahodia is to make known. If you don't make it known to me, that's what that me ending is. It's almost Hebrew. Okay, chelma, if you don't make known to me the dream, ufishre, and its interpretation, hadamin tit avdun, tit avdun, uvatechon nevale yit samon, right? The blood will be made of you, right? You will be made bloody. You'll be cut up into little pieces. Ubatechon, and your houses will be yitzamun, like instead of you, there's often a sin shin switch. Ida and I have been learning Arabic, and we noticed many times that there is a shin sin switch between Arabic and Hebrew, and similarly, there was a sin shin switch sometimes between Aramaic and Hebrew. So in that case, the Aramaic is closer to the Arabic, or Arabic is closer to Aramaic, however you want to hear about it. And so if you don't tell me all of these things, you'll be cut up into little pieces, and your houses will be Yushamu, will be like Lihishtomem, will be made desolate. Nivale is like on the garbage heaps of history. We're going to raise your houses. Okay, he's giving them no choice now that they've shown up, and so now you understand why the Chidah said, had they understood when he called to them saying, Lahagid l'melech chalamotav, had they understood what it was he was going to ask of them, they would have run for their lives and they wouldn't have been there. But they didn't know. And so they all of a sudden, they're standing there before him, and he says to them, tell me about it. And they say to him, well, tell us what the dream is, and then we can tell you what the solution is. And he says to them, no, it's escaped me. I need you to make known to me both the dream and its solution. And if you don't, that's the end of you and your households and your, so it's.
This just makes it so much more exciting to listen to.
I know, right?
Monster. He's such a monster.
Right. Okay. So we are now out of time. And so on this cliffhanger of a note, in the middle of this interview between him and all of these advisors, I bid you good night. And Emir Hashem, we will meet again next Tuesday evening.
Okay. Thank you. It was great.
Okay.
Love you.
Love you too. Bach Meira, how you doing? Wait a second. Let me figure out how to get this big. Here we are.
Have good dreams.
Yes, have good dreams. And if you have a bad dream and you need somebody to interpret it for you, don't threaten them with their lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Good to see you.